The United States went to war in 1917 without a single tank of its own. France provided the solution: the Renault FT, a 6.5-ton two-man vehicle with a fully rotating turret, a configuration so fundamentally correct that every tank built since has used some version of it. American crews trained on it, fought in it at Saint-Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne, and came home having seen the future of land warfare. The army agreed with their assessment. The FT had demonstrated what armored warfare could be. The institution that operated it chose to copy it, underfund it, and spend 2 decades arguing about what tanks were actually for. America's first domestically produced tank was a copy of the Renault FT, built under license before the war ended. It arrived too late. The first units reached France after the armistice, having contributed nothing to the conflict that justified their production. Through the 1920s and into the 1930s, American tankers trained on technology that was already obsolete when delivered, flying recognition triangles from tanks that could be defeated by anti-tank rifles. The M1917 did not fail as a weapon, it failed as a foundation. It told the army that copying someone else's answer to yesterday's problem was sufficient, a lesson that would cost considerably more than the M1917 program the second time the army learned it. J. Walter Christie built tanks the US Army refused to buy and sold the designs to everyone else. His M1931 reached 40 miles per hour on tracks in testing, faster than most roads of the era permitted, using a suspension system of large road wheels and long-travel coil springs that absorbed terrain in a way that no contemporary design could match. The army tested 8 of them, found the armor too thin and the designer too difficult, and declined to order more. Britain built their cruiser tanks around it. The army had evaluated the only suspension system that would define modern armored warfare, and concluded it was not worth the contract. The cavalry got its armored vehicle by renaming it. The National Defense Act of 1920 reserved tanks for the infantry, so when the cavalry needed armored vehicles for reconnaissance, the solution was to designate them something else. The M1 combat car was mechanically a tank, tracked, armored, gun-armed, called a combat car to satisfy a legal restriction rather than a tactical requirement. It served in cavalry reconnaissance through the late 1930s and was thoroughly outclassed before it was widely issued. What it documents is an institutional preference for paperwork solutions to doctrinal problems. The army had not decided what armored vehicles were for. It had decided what they were called. 94 M2 medium tanks were completed before the program was cancelled. None saw combat. The army had been watching the German campaigns in Poland and France, watching 37mm guns and riveted armor prove insufficient against the armor the Wehrmacht had crossed the continent with, and continued producing the M2 anyway, because the contracts were signed, the factories were tooled, and nothing better was ready to replace it. The M2 medium was a weapon the army had intellectually abandoned before it finished paying for it. It exists in the record as evidence that procurement timelines and battlefield requirements operate in different dimensions, and that the gap between them is measured in whatever comes after the shooting starts. Fast, mechanically reliable, and available in numbers the medium tank program could not yet match, it gave the British thousands of vehicles under Lend-Lease that could actually cross the North African desert when heavier equipment could not. Against Italian light armor and German reconnaissance elements, the Stuart performed. Against the Panzer IV, with its long 75, it was a death sentence. The army kept ordering them because the Sherman had not arrived yet, and something that moved and shot was better than nothing. The Stuart was never a solution. It was a placeholder, and the officers signing the procurement forms knew it was a placeholder while they were signing them. The Titans of Defense on curiositystream.com goes deeper on this, from the first tanks to the most advanced armor ever built. Use code DVSU25 for 25% off. Link in the description. The M3 Lee was an engineering response to a manufacturing problem. The Army needed a tank with a 75mm gun immediately, but could not machine a turret ring large enough to accept one. The vehicle worked. It gave Allied forces in North Africa a gun that could penetrate German armor at combat ranges when nothing else could. It was also 13 feet tall, visible from considerable distances, and obsolete by the standards of every tank being built in 1942. The Lee stayed in production until something better could replace it. It was a two-gun compromise, built around the fact that American industry could not yet do what the battlefield required. It was something more important: the tank the United States could produce in the numbers the war required. 50,000 built across multiple variants by factories that had been making automobiles 18 months earlier. Against the Panther and Tiger, the Sherman was outgunned and under-armored, a fact the Army knew and accepted as the price of availability. The tactical answer was numerical superiority and mechanical reliability. The Sherman broke down less frequently than its German opponents and could be repaired faster when it did. Whether that answer was sufficient is a question the crews who fought in them answered differently than the planners who sent them there. Additional armor plate was added to the hull and turret of a standard M4A3, increasing the thickness to a level that could deflect the guns most German armor and anti-tank weapons carried. The weight increased to 42 tons. The top speed dropped accordingly. 254 were produced for the Normandy campaign, specifically for leading assaults on fortified positions where the standard Sherman's protection was insufficient for the task being assigned to it. The Jumbo was a combat modification of a vehicle that had been in production for 2 years, an admission, bolted on in sections, that the original design had been optimized for production rather than protection. For the first time in an American light tank program, the vehicle performed the role it was given without requiring its crews to compensate for its limitations through courage rather than capability. Lighter than the Stuart, faster, better armed with a 75mm gun that could defeat most of what it would encounter in the reconnaissance role it was designed for. It arrived in Europe in late 1944 and served in Korea, where it was outmatched by Soviet T-34s, but operated effectively in the terrain and infantry support missions that actually characterized that war. The Chaffee represented the Army arriving at what a light tank should be, after having produced several designs that demonstrated what it should not be. 40 vehicles were produced, declared obsolete before any reached combat, and then used for recruiting photography. The Army had ordered a heavy tank in 1940 to counter potential German armor advances, received a design weighing 57 tons with a 76mm main gun and a coaxial 37, and then decided that logistics in the European theatre could not support vehicles of that weight, and that the Sherman was adequate anyway. The 40 hulls sat in depots. Their most significant operational contribution was appearing in promotional materials designed to demonstrate American industrial capacity to an audience that would never see one in battle. One program had a specific enemy in mind: the Tiger II. By the spring of 1944, American tank crews in Europe were encountering German heavy armor that the Sherman's 75 could not defeat at combat ranges, and the Army's response was a heavy tank program, built around a 105mm gun on a hull weighing 71 tons. The T-29 reached the testing phase in 1947. The war had been over for 2 years. The Tiger IIs it was designed to kill had been scrapped or captured. It was a weapon built for a threat that had dissolved before the weapon was ready. The T-28 was built on a single assumption: that the Army would have to storm the Siegfried Line and the concrete fortifications protecting the German heartland, and that nothing currently in the inventory could do it. The vehicle that resulted weighed 86 tons, carried a 105mm gun, moved at 8 miles per hour, and had so much armor that the designers removed the turret entirely to keep the weight manageable, producing a self-propelled gun that could not rotate its main armament. 2 were completed. The atomic bomb ended the war before either reached Europe. The T-28 was built for a tactical problem that technology solved in a different direction. February 1945. A 90mm gun and frontal armor that could contest the Panther at combat ranges. The army had been arguing about whether a heavy tank was worth the logistical burden since 1943, while the crews of the tanks it had sent to fight that argument were learning the answer from the German side. The Pershing was correct. It arrived correct, and it arrived too late, which is a precise description of how the United States Army managed its armor program for the entire war. The crews who finally got it knew exactly what the 2-year delay had cost. What Korea needed was the Pershing rebuilt around a better engine and transmission, and that is what arrived. The Continental AV-1790 and Allison CD-850 gave it the reliability the M26 had lacked, and when North Korean T-34s crossed the 38th parallel in June 1950, the M46 was the tank the Army sent to meet them. The 90mm gun defeated the T-34 at ranges the Korean War typically allowed, which settled the immediate question. What it also demonstrated was that the United States had entered a second major war with armor that was adequate rather than superior, a position the Army had occupied in 1941 and had apparently not considered sufficiently instructive. It entered production as a stopgap following the Korean War, using a new turret on the M46 hull, and was supplanted by the M48 before it had an opportunity to demonstrate itself in combat with American crews. Thousands were exported to NATO allies, where they served in various conflicts for decades, in Pakistan against India, in Israel against Arab armies, in Portugal's colonial wars in Africa. The tank the United States Army designated its standard, and then never used in battle, became one of the most combat-experienced designs of the Cold War era, just not in the hands it was built for. Nuclear doctrine shaped the specification. The M48 Patton was designed for a nuclear battlefield that never materialized. The specifications called for a tank that could survive close to an atomic detonation, operate in contaminated environments, and advance through terrain that conventional weapons had failed to clear. American doctrine in the early 1950s assumed that tactical nuclear weapons would precede any conventional armored advance. In Vietnam, where the M48 actually fought, it operated in jungle, provided direct fire support to infantry, and engaged enemy forces that had no armor of their own. The M48 was not built for counterinsurgency. It performed counterinsurgency adequately, in the way that expensive and precisely engineered equipment performs any task it was not designed for. The Soviet IS-3 heavy tank had appeared at Berlin in 1945 with armor and a 122mm gun that American 90mm weapons could not reliably defeat. The M103 answered with a 120mm gun that required 2 loaders and reduced the crew's ability to do anything quickly. The Army deactivated its M103 battalions in 1960 when the M60 arrived, concluding that 1 tank doing everything was more practical than 2 tanks doing different things. The Marine Corps kept them until 1973. The heavy tank class it represented has not existed in American service since, because the problem it was built to solve turned out to be solvable with a better main battle tank. Steel thickness and slope angle, the M60 was the last American tank built entirely on that premise, trusting it to stop what was coming. A philosophy that had worked for 30 years and was about to stop working. It fought in Vietnam, served in the Israeli Defense Forces against Soviet-built armor in 1967 and 1973, and remained in American service through the Gulf War, where Marine M60A1s with reactive armor conducted the breach of Iraqi defenses at Kuwait. What did not change was the fundamental protection approach. And when composite armor appeared in the next generation, the M60 became the last expression of a method rather than the first of something new. A light enough vehicle could carry a large enough gun, if the gun fired a missile rather than a conventional shell. The MG M51 Shillelagh missile system worked in testing and failed in Vietnam, where humidity, dust, and operational conditions exposed the reliability limits of early guided weapons technology. In Panama and Desert Storm, Sheridans proved that an air-dropped armored vehicle with a large caliber weapon was tactically useful even when its primary system was unreliable. The Sheridan answered a real requirement imperfectly, which is a better outcome than most of the cancelled programs that were supposed to replace it managed. Testing at Aberdeen demonstrated it was ready. The T-92 was the best light tank the Army never fielded. Then Congress learned the Soviets had deployed the amphibious PT-76, and the Army was asked whether the T-92 could swim. It could not. The hull design that made it light and low made it impossible to waterproof for amphibious operation without rebuilding it from the beginning. The program was cancelled in 1958. The tank that replaced it was the M551 Sheridan, a vehicle that tried to be everything the T-92 was not and spent 20 years demonstrating why that was difficult. In 1955, Chrysler submitted a concept for a tank that could survive a nuclear battlefield by enclosing everything – crew, engine, ammunition, armament – inside a single boat-shaped hull that could float, absorb blast overpressure, and operate in contaminated environments without external exposure. The power system would be nuclear. The gun would fire through a fixed mantlet. The silhouette would be lower than any contemporary tank. It received serious evaluation. It was not built. The Chrysler TV-8 exists as a document of what armored vehicle design looks like when the threat environment has been taken to its logical conclusion and the engineers are still trying to find a vehicle that can survive it. $305 million. That is what the United States spent on a tank it never fielded. A joint program with West Germany begun in 1963, it was intended to produce a tank that would replace the M60 in both armies, a 152mm gun that fired both shells and missiles, a hydro-pneumatic suspension that automatically adjusted ride height, and a driver seated in the rotating turret rather than the hull. Germany withdrew in 1969, citing cost overruns and design disagreements. The technologies it developed, advanced armor, stabilized fire control, crew compartment design, were redirected into the program that produced the M1 Abrams. Congress cancelled the MBT-70 and immediately tried to save its best ideas in a cheaper package. The XM803 used the same basic hull as the MBT-70, but eliminated the rotating driver's station, simplified the suspension, and replaced the experimental gun launcher with a more conventional configuration. The per-unit cost was estimated at $500,000 to $600,000, considerably less than the MBT-70, but still too much for a Congress that had watched the original program consume $300 million without producing a deployable tank. The XM803 was cancelled in December 1971. The $20 million remaining in the program was transferred to a new development effort. That effort was designated XM1. It became the Abrams. It won its competition, met its requirements, received type classification, and was cancelled 1 year before production was scheduled to begin. Designed to replace the M551 Sheridan in the 82nd Airborne Division with an air-droppable light tank carrying a 105mm gun and a 3-man crew, the M8 was selected over 3 competing proposals in 1992, built as 6 prototypes, and evaluated against every performance specification it had been given. It satisfied them. The 82nd Airborne, which had been scheduled to receive 237 M8s beginning in 1997, instead received nothing. The M551 Sheridan was retired that same year without replacement. A procurement process that nearly cancelled it twice brought the M1 Abrams into service in 1980. Once in favour of keeping the MBT-70 program running, and once because the gas turbine engine it used consumed fuel at a rate that logistics planners found alarming. Critics said it would drink the army dry on a European battlefield. In February 1991, the 1st Armoured Division drove 200 miles in 100 hours through the Iraqi desert, destroying roughly 3,000 Iraqi armoured vehicles while losing 9 Abrams to enemy fire, none of which were penetrated from the front. The turbine performed. The fuel consumption turned out to be manageable. The critics were wrong about the tank. The gun the program had resisted for a decade was the Rheinmetall 120mm smoothbore, adopted as the M1A1's main armament after the American-made alternative was cancelled. The Rheinmetall was adopted. The M1A1 also introduced NBC protection designed for the nuclear, biological, and chemical environment that Cold War doctrine assumed would characterize any European conflict. When that conflict did not occur in Europe, and instead occurred in the Persian Gulf, the M1A1 demonstrated the Rheinmetall's effectiveness against Soviet-designed armor at ranges that exceeded the engagement envelopes of every tank it encountered. The gun the program had resisted for a decade performed exactly as the German engineers who designed it had said it would. Since the Second World War, tank designers had argued about an independent sight for the commander. The M1A2 settled it. That allowed simultaneous target acquisition while the gunner engaged a different threat. The commander's independent thermal viewer gave the M1A2 a hunter-killer capability no previous American tank had possessed. It also added digital communications architecture, a position navigation system, and a thermal management system for the electronics, weight that raised the vehicle to nearly 70 tons and reduced the operational range between fuel stops. Whether those trade-offs were worth the cost was a question that subsequent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan answered differently in different operational contexts. 40 years after the Abrams, the Army fielded a new armoured vehicle class, and officially, it is not a tank. The Army designated it a mobile protected firepower vehicle to avoid the logistical and doctrinal implications of calling it what it is: a light tank for infantry brigade combat teams that lack organic armor support. The designation echoes the M1 combat car of 1937, when the cavalry called its tanks combat cars to satisfy a different statutory restriction. A century after the Renault FT arrived from France, the Army is still building armored vehicles and still arguing about what to call them.